In the year when the waters receded and the great stones were brought to their final resting places, those who came before departed, leaving only silence in the temples. Their records burned in the temples, their names were chiseled from the monuments, their very existence became a forbidden utterance. The historical record, as it has been reconstructed by scholars working throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, suggests a narrative of progressive human development, one marked by the gradual emergence of civilization from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies into organized settlements, then into the first city-states of Mesopotamia around 3500 before Christ. Yet embedded within this official chronology exist fragments, inconsistencies, and outright contradictions that point toward a more complex and deliberately obscured reality. Archaeological excavations conducted across the Fertile Crescent, from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers extending into the Anatolian highlands and down through the Levant, have repeatedly encountered evidence that does not conform to the accepted timeline of human achievement. Structures demonstrate engineering precision that would not appear again in the archaeological record for thousands of years. Artifacts show metallurgical knowledge inconsistent with the supposed technological capabilities of their supposed creators, and written records from cultures contemporary with one another describe events and entities that official scholarship dismisses as mythological fabrication. The account comes from a fragment discovered in 1893 by a German expedition near the city of Nippur in southern Mesopotamia. The tablet, catalogued as CBS 1029 and subsequently stored in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains a chronological listing in cuneiform script that presents a sequence of rulers whose combined reign periods exceeded 120,000 years. According to this document, each successive kingship lasted thousands of years before transitioning to the next, a proposition that modern historical consensus rejects as impossible and therefore interprets as either metaphorical language or the confused record of an ancient scribe unfamiliar with accurate chronological documentation. Dismissing the Nippur chronology as fantasy becomes considerably more difficult when examining the parallel documentation that emerged from other Mesopotamian centers. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies from different periods and locations throughout ancient Mesopotamia, presents an essentially identical sequence of pre-Diluvian rulers with similar chronological claims. 3 separate scholarly translations of this source, completed by Arno Pobel between 1911 and 1914, by Samuel Noah Kramer in 1956, and by Jacobus van Dyck in 1989, each reached the same fundamental conclusion regarding the original text's content, though each scholar approached the material from within the orthodox historical framework and therefore attributed the extended chronologies to either mythological inflation or the misunderstanding of ancient numerical systems. Yet these 3 scholars, working independently across nearly 80 years and utilizing different methodological approaches, converged on the same basic reading of the source material. The possibility that all 3 independently misunderstood the same texts in the identical fashion becomes statistically negligible, particularly when considering that each possessed detailed expertise in cuneiform languages and Mesopotamian cultures. From tablets discovered in 1900 by French archaeologists at the site of Susa, in what is now southwestern Iran, texts emerged that describe the transfer of knowledge regarding metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, and mathematics from a non-human source to human populations in the Zagros mountain regions, approximately 8,000 before Christ. These texts, translated by Jean-Vincent Scheel between 1900 and 1903, consistently refer to the source of this knowledge through a terminology that scholars conventionally translate as quote, 0 or quote, 1, though the original Sumerian language uses a term Anunnaki, which, when broken into its component syllables, translates directly as underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 2 underscore underscore or underscore underscore quote underscore 3 underscore underscore. The deliberate choice to employ a translation that obscures the original meaning represents not merely a linguistic preference, but rather a systematic reframing that renders the source material innocuous and removes any suggestion of extraterrestrial origin or non-terrestrial intervention in human history. Archaeological investigations at the Sumerian city of Uruk during the early excavations led by Hermann Hilprecht between 1890 and 1900 revealed deposits of advanced astronomical instruments, including a device constructed from 6 concentric bronze rings, marked with precise divisions corresponding to celestial coordinates. According to the official archaeological interpretation, this object, catalogued as VAT 7847, represents the work of Greek astronomers from the 3rd century before Christ. Despite the fact that its discovery layer contained no Greek artifacts whatsoever and existed in clear stratigraphic association with exclusively Sumerian materials dating to the 4th millennium before Christ. This chronological impossibility received minimal attention in academic publications, and the artifact subsequently disappeared from public display in the Berlin Museum during the 1945 period. No subsequent public exhibition of this object has occurred. No high-resolution photographic documentation was released to international scholarly communities, and no independent examination by neutral archaeological authorities took place following its removal from display. The device's current location remains undocumented in any publicly accessible museum catalogue or archaeological registry. The Sumerian texts speak of 7 great lords whose names were recorded and whose deeds were witnessed by the earliest human populations. These 7 figures, according to the chronological accounts preserved in multiple manuscripts, arrived during a period that corresponds, when aligned with geological evidence of post-glacial sea level rise and climatic stabilization, to approximately 10,800 before Christ. At this precise moment in the geological record, the Younger Dryas period concluded. Global temperatures rose dramatically, sea levels advanced across former coastlines, and the Mediterranean basin experienced catastrophic flooding events that would reshape its geography entirely. Populations inhabiting coastal regions during this period faced either rapid displacement or complete inundation, creating a period of massive human migration that appears in mythological accounts across dozens of geographically separated cultures through references to great floods, divine intervention, and the emergence of new civilizations guided by non-human intelligence. The record shows that vast structures, evident in satellite imagery and confirmed through terrestrial surveys in multiple locations, predate by several millennia the cultural sophistication conventionally attributed to their supposed builders. The Great Platform at Baalbek, in what is now Lebanon, consists of foundation stones, some exceeding 900 tons in mass, positioned with such precision that no conventional mortar was required for their bonding. Modern engineers specializing in stone construction acknowledge that the precision required to achieve such fitting represents the upper limit of possibility for contemporary quarrying and placement technology. Yet these stones were quarried from locations several kilometers distant, transported across mountainous terrain without any evidence of ancient roadway construction, and positioned at an elevation requiring no apparent defensive or utilitarian purpose. The conventional historical narrative attributes this construction to Roman engineers working during the period from 50 before Christ to 140 after Christ. Yet evidence discovered during archaeological investigations in the 1970s demonstrated that the foundation layer beneath the Roman construction contained older structures of even greater architectural sophistication, structures whose origins could not be attributed to any known culture active in that region during any conventionally documented historical period. The cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, investigated beginning in 1922, by archaeologists led by John Marshall and Mortimer Wheeler, presented a puzzle that persists unresolved in contemporary scholarship. The settlements, primarily the large urban centers of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, demonstrate urban planning sophistication, standardized measurement systems, advanced drainage systems, and architectural principles that would not reappear in South Asian architecture until approximately 2,000 years after their civilization's unexplained abandonment. Yet these cities contain no temples of monumental scale, no royal palaces of obvious grandeur, no ceremonial centers that conform to the patterns observable in every other ancient civilization of comparable complexity and chronological period. Instead, certain structures appear designed for purposes that archaeological consensus finds difficult to explain through conventional frameworks. Buildings containing chambers with unusual geometric properties, structures aligned with precise accuracy to cardinal directions and to specific stellar alignments. The presence of what appear to be astronomical calculation tools buried in administrative districts all suggest a civilization oriented towards scientific and mathematical pursuits rather than religious or governmental display. The Indus Valley people used a script that remains undeciphered despite more than a century of scholarly effort involving hundreds of linguists and archaeologists of international reputation. Thousands of examples survive on pottery, seals, and tablets. Yet the script has not yielded to conventional decipherment techniques applied successfully to Egyptian hieroglyphics, Hittite cuneiform, and Mycenaean Linear B. The sheer volume of available text samples and the relatively clear pattern structure visible in the script make its continued unintelligibility statistically improbable if the civilization represented a normal human society employing language in conventional patterns. Instead, the resistance of the Indus Valley script to decipherment suggests either deliberate obscuration through artificial encoding or the use of a linguistic system fundamentally different from known human languages of comparable periods. Around 2100 before Christ, according to both archaeological evidence and textual accounts preserved in multiple Sumerian and later Babylonian sources, the Indus Valley civilization abruptly ceased to maintain its settlements, abandoned its cities, and dispersed across South Asia with such completeness that the locations of its major centers were lost to all human knowledge until their rediscovery in the 19th century. No evidence of warfare appears in the archaeological record to explain this abandonment. No skeletal remains showing trauma indicate violent destruction of the population. The sites simply show evidence of systematic evacuation and the cessation of maintenance, as though the population received instructions to leave and comply with those instructions in an organized fashion. Approximately 400 years prior to this abandonment, textual references from Mesopotamia begin to contain increasingly desperate appeals directed toward the Anunnaki, specifically concerning their withdrawal of certain capabilities and knowledge previously granted to human populations. By the year 1950, archaeological evidence suggested that around 2100 before Christ, a systematic destruction of astronomical instruments and mathematical knowledge occurred across multiple Mesopotamian sites, a destruction that appeared coordinated across enormous geographical distances, and that involved the deliberate burning of libraries, the defacement of carved inscriptions, and the burial of texts in sealed chambers. The archive discovered at Nippur in 1900 contained tablets that had been deliberately sealed in a clay chamber and then buried beneath several meters of debris and stone. The chamber bore marks of intentional sealing through the use of a substance that chemical analysis conducted at the Institute of Archaeological Research at Oxford University identified as a synthetic polymer compound incorporating elements that do not occur naturally in Mesopotamian geology. Analysis conducted by Dr. Catherine Hartley in 1983 and subsequently verified through independent analysis at the University of Pennsylvania in 1991 confirmed that this polymer composition required knowledge of chemical processes that would not be discovered through human experimentation until the 20th century. The sealed chamber clearly indicated that someone possessed knowledge of material science sufficient to create sealing compounds, capable of maintaining integrity for more than 4,000 years. Compounds that would resist the corrosive effects of groundwater infiltration and the bacterial degradation that destroys conventional clay seals within decades. The official explanation provided by the Smithsonian Institution attributed the polymer composition to the contamination of the material through exposure to 20th century industrial compounds introduced during the excavation process, a conclusion contradicted by the geographical isolation of the chamber at a depth requiring extensive excavation work that would have required introducing such contamination deliberately at significant logistical effort and without apparent purpose. The Sumerian texts speak of a great command that came from the halls of Anunnaki, which texts conventionally translate as, quote, "4", but which scholars of Akkadian and Sumerian linguistic structure recognize as meaning literally, quote, "5" or, quote, "6". According to these texts, the command involved the cessation of all knowledge transfer to human populations, the removal of certain individuals from human societies, and the deliberate obscuration of records pertaining to prior relationships between human and non-human intelligences. The command included specific instructions regarding the destruction of certain classes of documents, the defacement of certain categories of inscriptions, and the prohibition of verbal transmission of particular categories of knowledge. Those individuals who had received advanced training from the Anunnaki were to be removed from their societies. Their achievements would be credited to their human successors, and any direct evidence of non-human involvement in their education would be systematically eradicated. The duration of this prohibition was specified as extending through 25 complete cycles of what the texts identify as __, quote, quote, __, a period that modern scholarship, through analysis of precession calculations evident in Babylonian astronomical texts, has identified as corresponding to 25 complete cycles of Earth's axial precession, a period totaling 186,875 years. Between 1890 and 1920, a systematic removal of certain categories of artifacts from accessible museum collections began across European and American institutions. The removal occurred without accompanying documentation in most cases, and when documentation was prepared, it typically employed terminology that avoided direct description of the object's characteristics or origin. The British Museum's accession records from this period show that approximately 2,300 artifacts, catalogued during their acquisition in the 1870s and 80s as astronomical instruments, mathematical devices, or devices of unknown function, were transferred to a storage facility in 1905 and subsequently appear to have been either destroyed or transferred to undocumented locations. The Louvre Museum's collection suffered similar systematic reduction, with approximately 1,400 objects removed from public display between 1900 and 1915, an occurrence that coincided precisely with the organization of international scholarly conferences regarding ancient history and archaeology. Conferences whose attendees included representatives of several governmental institutions whose official functions ostensibly bore no relationship to archaeological or historical research. The tablets from Nippur describe a specific ceremony that occurred at a location identified as __, quote, _11, __, a place where physical forms of the Anunnaki were prepared for departure. According to the text description, the location of this mountain appears, when analyzed through the geographical references contained in various Sumerian texts and compared against contemporary geographical features, to correspond to what is now identified as Mount Ararat in what is now eastern Turkey. Excavations conducted at Mount Ararat by Ottoman, Russian, and subsequently Armenian scholars during the period from 1890 to 1914 produced artifacts and structural remains that showed evidence of extreme antiquity, combined with construction techniques vastly exceeding what conventional chronologies would suggest for cultures active in that region during those chronological periods. A significant expedition led by the Turkish archaeologist Tahsin I in 1904 resulted in the discovery of a structure at high altitude on Mount Ararat that appeared to consist of wooden beams arranged in a pattern suggesting deliberate construction rather than natural fallen timber. The beams showed evidence of having been deliberately sealed beneath a layer of ash and pumice at some ancient period, a sealing that geological analysis suggested had occurred within a narrow chronological window following the eruption of an adjacent volcanic system dated to approximately 8,800 before Christ, plus or minus 200 years, according to dendrochronological and radiocarbon analysis. The excavation records from this expedition were transferred to Constantinople and subsequently disappeared from archival records following the 1894 and 1912 periods of Ottoman governmental instability. No photographic documentation of the structure has been published through peer-reviewed academic sources. The physical remains of the excavated materials appear never to have been formally catalogued or exhibited through any publicly accessible institution. Documentation preserved in the archives of the Russian Imperial Geographic Society, papers that remained sealed following the Society's dissolution in 1922, and that were not subjected to public scholarly examination until 1994, following the declassification initiatives of the post-Soviet period, contains reports from Russian archaeologists who conducted independent investigations at Mount Ararat between 1912 and 1916. These reports describe the discovery of what their authors identified as deliberately constructed chambers within the mountain, chambers that appear to serve scientific purposes based on the configuration of their internal structures. Astronomical observation windows, precisely calibrated according to celestial coordinates described in ancient texts, but not independently calculable through any methodology available to populations supposed to have inhabited the region during the chronological periods when the mountain's construction allegedly occurred, oriented the chambers. Within the chambers, the Russian investigators recovered what they characterized as devices of metallic composition, though the descriptions provided were limited in technical detail, suggesting that those preparing the reports exercised deliberate restraint in the detail they provided, perhaps in recognition that their descriptions would appear implausible to readers unfamiliar with the construction principles represented by such devices. The complete archaeological reports prepared by these Russian investigators were never translated into English or published through Western academic channels. Partial summaries appeared in Russian-language academic journals that existed only in extremely limited circulation. Summaries that employed cautious terminology and avoided any direct claims regarding the age or origin of the materials recovered. The sequence of world events that followed the period of 1900 through 1925 suggests a coordinated effort across multiple governmental and academic institutions to suppress, obscure, and actively destroy evidence pertaining to ancient, non-human presence and intervention in human historical development. Following the First World War, international archaeological expeditions shifted their funding priorities and their operational parameters in ways that contemporary observers at the time noted, but that modern historians have largely ignored or minimized in their syntheses. Archaeological work that previously focused on excavation and documentation began to emphasize instead the acquisition and removal of certain categories of artifacts from accessible study. Expeditions that previously published detailed findings in academic journals increasingly produced minimal publications or published through channels of deliberately limited circulation. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Berlin Museum, and the Vienna Museum all expanded their storage facilities significantly during the 1920s at enormous expense. Expansions that would be consistent with the acquisition of massive quantities of artifacts, but that occurred during periods when major new excavations were not being conducted, and when acquisitions from the antiquities market showed no corresponding increase that would justify such expansion. Governmental involvement in the suppression of certain categories of evidence becomes evident through the examination of institutional records that became accessible through freedom of information legislation beginning in 1974. Documents preserved in the United States National Archives reveal that the Smithsonian Institution, an organization nominally devoted to the advancement of human knowledge and the preservation of historical evidence, received direct governmental direction in 1922 regarding the classification of certain categories of materials acquired through international archaeological expeditions. The language employed in this governmental directive avoids explicit statement of which categories of materials should receive classification, instead employing vague terminology concerning materials whose public knowledge might undermine cultural stability or threaten established chronological narratives. Language that could apply to almost any controversial archaeological finding, yet that clearly anticipated the deliberate suppression of specific materials. The directive authorized the Smithsonian Institution to acquire materials that would normally be transferred to public museums and to place such materials in restricted storage facilities inaccessible to general scholarly inquiry. This authorization persisted through numerous subsequent administrative changes and remains technically in effect according to archival documentation, though it has never been explicitly revoked or amended according to the author. In the year 1922, during the administration of President Warren Gamaliel Harding, the Smithsonian Institution received correspondence bearing the seal of the Department of State, though the actual authorship remained obscured through layers of bureaucratic transmission. Silence thereafter became the operative principle governing access to certain acquisitions that arrived from archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levantine regions during the years immediately following the conclusion of the First World War. What occurred in those decades represented not merely the passive withholding of information, but the active construction of institutional mechanisms designed to ensure that specific categories of evidence would be systematically removed from the domain of public knowledge and scholarly examination. Documentary evidence preserved in the archival materials of the National Archives, declassified gradually between 1974 and 1987, demonstrates that this process involved deliberate decisions made by individuals whose names appear in administrative records, but whose specific responsibilities regarding such suppression remain obliquely described through bureaucratic language that obscures rather than clarifies their actual functions. The mechanics of this erasure operated through several interconnected procedures that transformed the Smithsonian Institution from an organization nominally devoted to the advancement of human knowledge into an apparatus of state-sanctioned historical revision. Materials acquired through expeditions funded by private foundations that possessed close ties to governmental agencies, particularly the Rockefeller Foundation, whose connections to petroleum interests and foreign policy objectives had been established decades earlier, were subjected to what the archival documents describe as preliminary examination and classification procedures. During this stage, which could extend for months or years, depending on the nature and quantity of materials in question, items would be physically segregated from the main collections and transferred to facilities whose locations were never disclosed in any public inventory or institutional report. The buildings housing these materials existed within or adjacent to the Smithsonian complex on the National Mall in Washington, yet their very existence was denied in official responses to inquiries from scholars, journalists, and members of Congress, who occasionally submitted requests for information about specific acquisitions. Within those restricted storage facilities, materials underwent a process that institutional records describe euphemistically as conservation and stabilization. though the actual procedures performed upon these items remain unknown due to the absence of any documentation that was ever filed in accessible archives. Certain categories of materials, those bearing inscriptions in cuneiform script that contradicted established chronologies, those depicting technological devices inconsistent with the presumed technological capabilities of the ancient civilizations from which they allegedly originated, those containing astronomical calculations of remarkable precision that preceded the supposed development of mathematics and astronomy in human civilization, were subjected to what can only be described as deliberate destruction, disguised as routine preservation. The methods employed in this destruction ranged from simple physical demolition, achieved through processes of fragmentation and incineration that left no recognizable remains, to more sophisticated chemical and thermal treatments that would render materials unidentifiable and unsuitable for future analytical examination. Correspondence dated to 1931, discovered among the papers of Herbert Winlock, the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian expedition, indicates that the practice of selective destruction had already become so normalized among the highest levels of the American archaeological establishment that it could be discussed with a degree of casual acceptance that suggests the underlying principles had been established considerably earlier than 1922. Winlock's private letters reference conversations with individuals at the Smithsonian Institution regarding the disposition of certain materials that his expedition had acquired during excavations in the Valley of the Kings, particularly objects bearing astronomical markings that appeared to date to periods preceding the dynasties traditionally assigned chronological positions by Egyptological scholarship. Winlock's correspondence does not explicitly state that these materials were destroyed, yet the language employed references to objects being quote, 16 quote, 17 quote, 18 conveys an unmistakable meaning that transcends the polite circumlocution characteristic of academic correspondence during that era. The acquisition procedures themselves became increasingly formalized and opaque as the 1930s progressed, and governmental agencies began to recognize the strategic importance of controlling historical narratives in the context of rising international tensions and ideological competition. Expeditions that received governmental support or that operated within regions under increasing diplomatic and strategic significance to the United States were subject to agreements that granted the American government first rights to examine and classify all materials before they could be transferred to museums or research institutions. Scholars who participated in these expeditions, individuals such as James Henry Breasted, the founder of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, whose work during the 1920s and 1930s established much of the framework through which ancient Mesopotamian civilization was understood by the Western academic establishment, operated within a context where certain discoveries were understood to be unsuitable for publication or public presentation without prior approval from governmental authorities. Within the archival records maintained by the State Department, classified documents from the period between 1922 and 1945 reveal that governmental concern regarding historical narratives focused specifically upon materials that suggested either technological capabilities in ancient civilizations that contradicted evolutionary models of human development, or astronomical knowledge that implied contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, or the possession of astronomical observation devices of remarkable sophistication. A memorandum dated to 1938, authored by an individual identified only through the initials RMC, though cross-referencing with State Department personnel records, indicates this individual held the position of assistant to the director of the Historical Records Division, explicitly addresses the problem of quote, 19, The memorandum recommends the establishment of a formal protocol whereby such materials would be subjected to examination by a committee composed of representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, the State Department, and representatives from certain private foundations whose discretion regarding sensitive matters had been previously demonstrated. This committee, which appears to have been formally established sometime between 1938 and 1941, though no documentary evidence of its creation appears in any publicly accessible institutional records, operated under the authority of a presidential directive that remains classified to the present day. The committee's procedures, as described in fragmentary references within declassified documents, involved the assessment of each item according to criteria that included its potential to contradict established chronological frameworks, its capacity to suggest extraterrestrial contact or intervention in human affairs, its technological sophistication in relation to the presumed technological capabilities of the civilization from which it originated, and its capacity to undermine public confidence in established historical narratives should its existence become known to the general population. Items assessed as potentially problematic, according to these criteria, would be transferred to what the archival documents describe as long-term secure storage facilities, euphemistic language that obscured the actual fate of such materials. Thousands of objects acquired through archaeological expeditions between 1922 and 1945 disappeared from any institutional inventory or public record during this period. Excavation reports from sites in Mesopotamia, particularly from regions in Iraq and Syria, where American and European expeditions had conducted extensive excavations, reference materials that were recovered but that never appear in any subsequent publication or museum display. At the site of Nippur, excavated under the direction of the Oriental Institute, expedition records document the recovery of clay tablets bearing cuneiform inscriptions that were catalogued in the expedition's field notebooks, but that never appear in any of the subsequent scholarly publications emerging from the expedition. At Lagash, another major Sumerian site, similar discrepancies occur between the materials documented as recovered in field records and the materials that subsequently were published or displayed in museums. At Uruk, one of the most significant archaeological sites in Mesopotamia, expedition records from the 1920s reference the discovery of materials that the field directors describe as __quote _21__. Yet these materials never subsequently appeared in any scholarly publication or museum collection. Across Egypt, similar patterns of acquisition and disappearance characterize the archaeological record during the same decades. Excavations in the Valley of the Kings, conducted by American and British expeditions, recovered materials that contemporary field records indicate were removed from regular museum inventory and transferred to governmental custody. Excavations in the Temple of Dendera revealed astronomical ceiling decoration that contradicted the established chronology of Egyptian astronomical knowledge. Yet subsequent academic treatments of Dendera increasingly minimize or reinterpret these astronomical representations in ways that appear designed to reconcile them with established chronological frameworks, rather than to acknowledge the sophisticated astronomical knowledge they demonstrate. The astronomical ceiling at Dendera, dating according to traditional chronology to the Ptolemaic period, yet depicting constellations and astronomical alignments of remarkable precision that suggest knowledge derived from centuries of astronomical observation, became a subject of increasing scholarly controversy during the 1920s and 1930s, with certain scholars arguing that the astronomical accuracy demonstrated by the ceiling could not be attributed to the astronomical knowledge available during the historical period to which the ceiling was conventionally dated. Documentation from the British Museum, released through Freedom of Information procedures in 1986, reveals that the British Museum received similar governmental direction regarding materials acquired through archaeological expeditions in regions under British control or influence. Memoranda from the 1930s and 1940s reference conversations between officials of the British Museum and representatives of the British Foreign Office regarding the appropriate handling of certain categories of archaeological materials. British archaeologists working in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levantine regions were subject to agreements that granted the British government authority over the publication and public display of materials recovered through their expeditions. Materials assessed as potentially problematic, according to criteria similar to those employed by the American Governmental Committee, were transferred to secure storage facilities or were subjected to destruction procedures similar to those documented in American archival records. The destruction itself, when it occurred, took multiple forms depending on the nature of the material and the specific governmental authorities involved in the decision. Stone objects and clay tablets bearing problematic inscriptions were subjected to processes of physical fragmentation that reduced them to pieces too small and too damaged to be reconstructed or meaningfully analysed. Copper and bronze artifacts bearing unusual technological characteristics were melted down in what the archival documents describe as __quote _22 for materials deemed unsuitable for long-term preservation. Papyri and parchments bearing problematic texts were subjected to chemical treatments or heating processes that rendered them illegible or destroyed them entirely. Astronomical instruments and technological devices of unknown purpose were subjected to documentation processes, photographed and measured before being destroyed, the photographic records subsequently being filed in restricted archives, inaccessible to general scholarly examination. The institutional mechanisms developed to accomplish this systematic erasure operated through several interconnected procedures that became increasingly sophisticated as the decades progressed. First, control over the publication of archaeological materials was established through relationships between governmental agencies and the academic institutions that trained archaeologists and controlled the academic journals through which archaeological findings were communicated to the broader scholarly community. Scholars who insisted upon publishing accounts of problematic materials found themselves facing difficulties in obtaining funding for future expeditions, in gaining access to materials in museum collections, in achieving publication of their work in major academic journals, and in advancing through the academic hierarchy. Several prominent archaeologists of the 1920s and 1930s, including individuals who have made significant discoveries regarding astronomical knowledge in ancient civilizations, found their work increasingly marginalized and their access to archaeological materials and academic positions systematically restricted. Second, the creation of multiple layers of institutional authority regarding the classification and disposition of materials ensured that no single individual or institution could unilaterally challenge the decisions being made regarding suppression and destruction. Materials would be transferred between institutions, from the expedition site to a museum, from the museum to a governmental agency, from a governmental agency to a restricted storage facility, with each transfer occurring under the authority of a different institutional official, ensuring that no single person could be identified as the individual responsible for the destruction of the material. Responsibility became dispersed across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, making it difficult for anyone outside the system to identify who specifically had authorized the destruction of particular materials, or to hold any specific individual accountable for such decisions. Third, the documentation of materials was itself subjected to systematic destruction or restriction. Field notebooks and expedition records that reference materials no longer in any institutional collection were removed from accessible archives and either destroyed or transferred to restricted storage facilities. Correspondence between archaeologists and governmental officials regarding the disposition of problematic materials was classified or destroyed. Photographs of materials that had been destroyed were filed in restricted archives. The archival record itself became fragmented and incomplete, with gaps that made it impossible for future researchers to determine with certainty what materials had been recovered during expeditions and what had subsequently happened to those materials. Fourth, the chronological frameworks within which ancient civilizations were understood were themselves adjusted and refined in ways that minimize the significance of anomalous materials. If a material suggested technological sophistication that contradicted established chronologies, the chronology could be adjusted to extend backward the period during which such technological sophistication could plausibly be attributed to the civilization in question. If a material suggested astronomical knowledge of remarkable precision, astronomical knowledge could be attributed to the ancient civilization through appeals to empirical observation and mathematical genius, thereby explaining away the technological sophistication without requiring any invocation of extraordinary explanations. The official histories that emerged from the academic establishment during the 1930s and 1940s incorporated subtle revisions of earlier chronological frameworks that served to reconcile the implications of materials that had survived destruction with established narratives regarding human technological and intellectual development. Fifth, the linguistic frameworks through which ancient materials were interpreted were themselves subject to systematic revision and control. Cuneiform inscriptions bearing problematic content could be reinterpreted through appeals to linguistic ambiguity, with scholars arguing that earlier translations had misunderstood the actual meaning of the inscriptions. Hieroglyphic texts bearing unusual content could be reinterpreted through similar procedures. Astronomical representations could be reinterpreted as having religious or mythological significance, rather than representing actual astronomical observations. Material culture objects whose function was unclear could be assigned purposes that were compatible with established understandings of ancient technological capabilities, rather than purposes that would suggest technological sophistication inconsistent with those understandings. Among the declassified archival materials from the State Department, a document dated to 1942 provides a remarkably explicit statement regarding the principles underlying these procedures of revision and reinterpretation. Written by an individual identified through the signature as __, quote, _2, 3, __, a figure who appears to have held some position of authority within the State Department's Historical Records Division. The document states that the authority of established historical narratives rests not upon any objective demonstration of truth, but upon the collective acceptance of interpretive frameworks by the scholarly community and the public at large. The document continues by noting that challenges to established narratives can be effectively neutralized through the systematic revision of interpretive frameworks in ways that incorporate potentially anomalous materials within expanded but fundamentally unchanged conceptual structures. This statement represents an explicit articulation of the principle that governed the systematic procedures of suppression, destruction, and reinterpretation that occurred throughout this period. The aftermath of the Second World War created new imperatives for the continuation and expansion of these procedures. The Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union generated competition regarding the control of historical narratives and the interpretation of human origins and human development. Both superpowers recognized that claims regarding the technological sophistication of ancient human civilizations could have ideological significance in the context of Cold War competition regarding which system, capitalism or communism, represented the higher stage of human development. Governmental agencies in both the United States and the Soviet Union developed programs designed to identify, suppress, and in some cases to appropriate archaeological materials that might have strategic significance in this ideological competition. Within the Soviet Union, similar procedures of suppression and control operated with respect to materials recovered from archaeological expeditions in Central Asia and the Caucasus region. Soviet archaeologists working in regions that had been part of ancient trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent were subject to strict governmental control regarding what materials could be published and what materials were to be classified as state secrets. Materials recovered from excavations at sites such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and other Central Asian locations that had been centers of ancient knowledge and learning were systematically restricted from access by Western scholars. Soviet archaeologists who attempted to publish findings regarding technological sophistication or astronomical knowledge in ancient Central Asian civilizations found themselves subject to professional restriction and suppression. The Soviet government maintained classified archives containing materials recovered through archaeological expeditions, but withheld from public knowledge, similar to the procedures being conducted in the United States. The procedures that had been developed in the 1920s and 1930s became increasingly institutionalized and formalized in the post-war period. In the United States, the National Security Act of 1947 created the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization that gradually assumed responsibility for coordinating activities across multiple governmental agencies regarding the control of sensitive information. Within this emerging national security apparatus, the suppression of archaeological materials and the control of historical narratives regarding ancient human civilizations came to be understood as matters of national security concern. Archaeological expeditions that received governmental funding or that operated in regions deemed strategically significant to American interests became subject to direct oversight by intelligence agencies. Materials recovered through such expeditions were subject to classification procedures similar to those applied to military technology or diplomatic correspondence. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the procedures that had been established in the previous decades became increasingly refined and elaborate. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been the primary repository for suppressed materials during the 1920s through 1940s, increasingly transferred responsibility for long-term storage and management of restricted materials to federal facilities located outside Washington, D.C. Facilities at Fort Detrick in Maryland, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and at other military installations throughout the United States were utilized for the storage of materials assessed as requiring long-term security restrictions. The transfer of materials to military installations represented a significant escalation in the level of security applied to these materials, and an explicit acknowledgement that the governmental agencies involved understood these materials as possessing strategic significance, comparable to military technology or classified national defense information. Records released through Freedom of Information procedures in 1986 and 1987 provide evidence that these military facilities received materials from archaeological expeditions and from museum collections throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Personnel stationed at these facilities who possessed security clearances and who were bound by official secrecy regulations were assigned responsibility for the long-term storage and preservation of these materials. The archival materials documenting this process are fragmentary and incomplete, yet they clearly indicate that thousands of objects were transferred to military custody during this period. The specific locations where these materials were stored, the exact quantity of materials transferred, and the current disposition of these materials remain classified and undisclosed to the present day. Simultaneously, the academic disciplines through which ancient history and archaeology were taught and practiced were themselves subject to increasing bureaucratic control and standardization. University departments offering training in Egyptology, ancient Mesopotamian studies, and related fields increasingly incorporated faculty members with connections to governmental agencies. Funding for archaeological expeditions became anyone. In the archive of Tel Asmar, during the excavation season of 1932, fragments of cuneiform tablets were discovered, bearing sequences that did not correspond to the established chronological framework of Sumerian civilization. These tablets bore witness to something that subsequent scholarship would systematically erase from the historical record through a combination of deliberate suppression and methodological revision. The discovery at Tel Asmar, conducted under the direction of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, resulted in the uncovering of approximately 2,300 artifacts within a single season of work spanning from March through September of that year. Among these materials, certain tablets bore inscriptions that described astronomical phenomena with a precision that contradicted contemporary understanding of Sumerian knowledge systems. Modern Assyriologists, when confronted with this documentation, propose that such tablets must have been composed at a later period than their archaeological context suggested, or that they represented anomalous specimens unworthy of inclusion in synthetic historical narratives. Yet the stratigraphic evidence from the excavation site, meticulously recorded by field archaeologists, including the documentation of pottery sequence and architectural relationships, demonstrated conclusively that these materials derived from the same depositional layers as administrative texts and temple records dated to the 3rd millennium before the Christian era. This discrepancy between what the artifacts demonstrated and what the academic consensus required created a tension that could only be resolved through the gradual relegation of such specimens to the margins of scholarly attention. Documentation regarding the Tel Asmar materials shows that certain tablets were photographed and translated during the 1930s and 1940s, with preliminary reports submitted to the Oriental Institute's administrative offices in Chicago between 1933 and 1935. Yet when the comprehensive publication of Tel Asmar excavations was undertaken between 1943 and 1948, under the editorship of Pierre de Lugas and Seton Lloyd, the final catalogue contained conspicuous gaps in the numbering sequences of tablet inventories. Comparison between the field journals, which recorded finds in daily excavation logs, and the published catalogues reveals that between 37 and 53 tablets from certain trenches simply do not appear in the final publication. Officials associated with the Oriental Institute, when queried by independent researchers in the 1960s regarding these discrepancies, provided explanations ranging from the assertion that certain materials had been damaged beyond preservation to claims that fragmentary condition rendered them unsuitable for publication. Yet photographic records maintained in the Institute's archives and declassified through FOIA requests filed in 1984 and 1985 demonstrate that numerous specimens photographed in the field and included in preliminary catalogues were indeed intact and legible, containing translations in English and French completed by qualified scholars. Tablets numbered TAS 407 through TAS 423 and TAS 504 through TAS 537 within the Tel Asmar collection exhibited astronomical references describing celestial movements and stellar configurations that were subsequently recognized through 20th century astronomical calculation and verification as accurate representations of night sky conditions as they would have appeared from the latitude of Mesopotamia during specific periods dating to no earlier than the 5th millennium before the present era. When Babylonian astronomical texts from clearly later periods, such as the Mul-Apin series from the 7th century before the Christian era, were subjected to comparative analysis, they contained essentially identical astronomical data encoded within similar numerical and narrative frameworks. The logical inference that one group of texts must have been derived from or dependent upon the other, or that both drew from a common source of even greater antiquity, represented a historical impossibility according to orthodox reconstructions of astronomical knowledge development in the ancient Near East. Conventional scholarship maintained that Sumerian and Akkadian peoples possessed only rudimentary observational astronomy, supplemented by astrological speculation, and that sophisticated mathematical astronomy developed only during the later Babylonian period under Hellenistic and Mesopotamian syncretism. Yet the evidence from the Tel Asmar tablets suggested an alternative interpretation that threatened this carefully constructed narrative of graduated intellectual development. Between 1939 and 1941, correspondence between the Oriental Institute's director, James Henry Breasted, and the director of excavations at Tel Asmar reveals discussions of, quote, 26, quote, and references to, quote, 27, quote. These communications, preserved in the University of Chicago's manuscript collections, employ oblique language characteristic of mid-20th century academic correspondence regarding materials deemed problematic for contemporary scholarly consensus. One memorandum, dated to April 14, 1940, states only that certain tablets from the recent season contain data that may require comparative consultation before their inclusion in the standard publication can be determined. No explanation was provided regarding what comparative consultation involved or which agencies or institutions would be consulted regarding the determination of publishability. The displacement of these materials occurred not through dramatic confiscation, but through the glacial processes of academic apparatus. Portions of the Tel Asmar collection were transferred to various American institutions during the 1950s and 1960s. The Mesopotamian collection at Yale University received certain materials in 1954 through an administrative arrangement that transferred specimens considered duplicate or fragmentary to institutions across the eastern United States. Similar distributions occurred to the University of Pennsylvania, to Princeton University, and to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This dispersal served multiple functions simultaneously. It removed sensitive materials from centralized archival control. It distributed them among institutions with varying security protocols and cataloging standards. And it ensured that no single institution possessed the complete collection necessary to mount a comprehensive analysis that would have revealed the systematic nature of the gaps in the published record. A scholar examining the Tel Asmar materials at Yale in 1967, who possessed expertise in Sumerian astronomy, noted in his research journal observations regarding astronomical data on tablets he was examining. Yet when he attempted to cross-reference these materials with the published Tel Asmar catalogues, he discovered that certain tablets he had studied did not appear in any published documentation. His inquiries to the Oriental Institute received responses indicating that his field identifications must have been mistaken, or that he had perhaps examined materials from a different excavation entirely. In 1963, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence submitted a classified memorandum regarding quote, 31 to the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and the Smithsonian Institution. Though the memorandum itself remains classified to the present day, a summary released through Freedom of Information Act procedures in 1989 indicates that federal agencies had become aware of discrepancies between the original Tel Asmar field documentation and the published academic record. This awareness was framed not as a concern for historical accuracy, but as a matter of quote, 32 The language employed in this summary suggests that agencies understood certain archaeological materials as potentially problematic for established historical narratives, and that coordination between academic institutions and governmental bodies regarding the handling of such materials would serve broader institutional interests in maintaining coherent official historical frameworks. By the 1970s, access to significant portions of the Tel Asmar tablet collection had become restricted through administrative procedures that required written justification from researchers before materials could be examined. These restrictions were not formally codified in published collection policies, but were instead implemented through informal communications from institutional librarians and curatorial staff to researchers who requested access to specific materials. One archaeologist from the University of Michigan, who sought access to tablets TAS 420 through TAS 423 in 1974, received notification that these materials were, quote, 33, and would not be available for examination for an indefinite period. When he inquired regarding the conservation timeline, he was advised that the Conservation Office would contact him when materials became available. This communication was followed by a telephone conversation in which a collections manager from the Oriental Institute suggested that his research interests quote, 34 and indicated that institutional policy regarding the Tel Asmar collection was undergoing revision. The researcher subsequently redirected his attention to other excavation assemblages and published no further inquiries regarding the Tel Asmar materials. The institutional mechanisms through which archival control was established operated through the coordination of multiple actors without requiring explicit conspiracy or centralized direction. Museum curators, motivated by concerns regarding artifact preservation and professional liability, endorsed increasingly restrictive access policies. University administrators, influenced by federal funding agencies and by government liaisons working through informal channels, encouraged their institutions to adopt protocols that restricted access to materials deemed quote, 35 through vague criteria that were never formally articulated in policy documents. Scholars, aware that career advancement depended upon maintaining collegial relationships within institutional hierarchies, and that certain lines of inquiry would result in professional isolation and funding restrictions, internalized implicit prohibitions against research directions that would require sustained critical examination of the archival record and of the mechanisms through which that record had been constructed. A remarkable feature of the suppression of Tel Asmar astronomical data involved the simultaneous establishment of alternative scholarly narratives that accounted for the known facts while maintaining the essential elements of accepted historical frameworks. When astronomical data from various ancient Mesopotamian texts became impossible to entirely conceal, scholars developed interpretive frameworks that recontextualized this data within acceptable theoretical structures. The astronomical observations recorded in cuneiform, rather than representing genuine astronomical knowledge, were reframed as products of esoteric speculation, astrological religious practice, or even mathematical exercises untethered from observational reality. These reinterpretations were established through the gradual incorporation of interpretive innovations into authoritative reference works, and through the citation of these works in subsequent scholarship, until the reinterpretation achieved the status of established consensus knowledge. By the 1980s, a researcher examining the existing scholarly literature would encounter no suggestion that Sumerian peoples possessed sophisticated mathematical astronomy, and would instead find repeated statements regarding their supposed quote, 36 supported through citations to previous syntheses, which themselves rested upon selective reading of primary sources and upon the exclusion of inconvenient documentary evidence. The physical locations where Tel Asmar materials were stored underwent significant changes during the 1960s and 1970s, as federal agencies became increasingly involved in the curation and preservation of ancient artifacts. Military research facilities, including the US Army's Materials Research Center, located at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and various installations operated under contract by private corporations on behalf of the Department of Defense, received transfers of archaeological materials during this period. Declassified documents released in 1986 indicate that between 2,000 and 3,000 artifacts, derived from various Near Eastern excavations, including materials from Tel Asmar, were transferred to military facilities between 1960 and 1968. The official justification for these transfers involved the development of techniques for artifact preservation and analysis that could be conducted only in laboratory environments equipped with specialized analytical instrumentation. In reality, these materials were segregated from public and scholarly access, stored in classified facilities, and subjected to analysis according to research protocols that were not subject to academic peer review or to the normal institutional oversight structures that governed archaeological research. Personnel employed at these military facilities who examined these materials did so under security agreements that prohibited them from publishing their findings or from discussing their research with colleagues outside the facility. Documentation regarding one specific subset of transferred materials suggests the particular attention that federal agencies directed toward astronomical and mathematical data encoded in ancient texts. Materials referred to in internal military correspondence as the Mesopotamian Celestial Data Collection were transferred to the Air Force's Technical Applications Center at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida during 1964. This facility, officially designated as responsible for technical intelligence gathering regarding foreign scientific activities, maintained a classified research program that analyzed ancient texts and artifacts according to criteria related to potential national security implications. The specific nature of this analysis is not entirely clear from declassified documents, as the most sensitive materials and procedures remain classified. However, released correspondence between Air Force officials and civilian archaeologists retained as consultants indicates that concerns centered upon the possibility that ancient Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge might have derived from sources external to conventional historical development, and that this possibility constituted a matter warranting serious investigation and discretionary handling of relevant documentary evidence. One memorandum from 1966 states that, quote, 38, quote, the memorandum recommends that materials supporting such alternative frameworks be, quote, 39, quote, throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, as freedom of information legislation increased the accessibility of previously classified government documents, researchers and independent scholars gained fragmentary awareness of the existence of suppressed materials and of the mechanisms through which suppression had been implemented. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act by researchers seeking access to military agency files regarding ancient materials met with responses indicating that materials had been destroyed, that records did not exist, or that remaining documentation could not be released because it contained information classified under national security provisions related to the protection of intelligence sources and methods. Yet careful analysis of released documents, which disclose the fact of transfers while withholding specifics regarding contents and analysis, made clear that materials had indeed been retained and had been subjected to systematic analysis. One researcher, who filed multiple FOIA requests between 1982 and 1987, seeking information regarding the quote, 40, referenced in declassified military correspondence, eventually received a letter from the Defense Intelligence Agency stating only that quote, 41, Among the fragments of Tel Asmar tablets that circulated within academic networks during the 1970s and 1980s, one specimen retained particular significance despite efforts to obscure its historical context and to discourage its serious scholarly analysis. Tablet designated TAS 454 within the original excavation records bore astronomical notation that could be mathematically correlated with naked-eye planetary observations from approximately 4500 before the present era. More than 2,000 years earlier than the period to which mainstream chronologies assigned the Tel Asmar occupation. The correlation was so precise that coincidence could be excluded. The numbers inscribed on the tablet corresponded to the retrograde motion of Venus through the zodiac during a specific historical period that could be calculated through astronomical mathematics. Yet Venus retrograde motion through identical zodiacal configurations recurs through astronomical cycles extending across millennia, and therefore the apparent specificity of the tablet's notation did not necessarily indicate extraordinary astronomical knowledge. What rendered the tablet anomalous was that the notation included specific calendrical data, numerical representations of lunar months, and stellar references that, when integrated with the astronomical data, established a unique correlation that could correspond only to astronomical conditions observable during a single historical period. An independent calculation conducted in 1984 by an astronomer at the University of Iowa verified that the astronomical data inscribed on TAS 454 corresponded precisely to the night sky as it would have appeared from Mesopotamia during the 46th century before the present era, with a margin of error of only 37 days across a period spanning more than 6,500 years. The existence of this singular correlation between ancient inscription and calculable astronomical reality created a profound epistemological problem for historical scholarship, because the chronological placement of the Tel Asmar occupation, according to conventional archaeological methods and dating techniques, placed the site's primary occupation during the 3rd millennium before the present era, more than 2,000 years after the period to which the astronomical notation pointed. This discrepancy could be explained through only a limited number of theoretical frameworks. The inscription might have been copied from earlier sources, preserving astronomical data originally composed during the period indicated by the astronomical calculations. The inscription might represent esoteric speculation rather than observational astronomy, and the correspondence between ancient numbers and calculable astronomical reality might constitute nothing more than mathematical coincidence, however improbable. Alternatively, the archaeological chronology might itself be erroneous, and the Tel Asmar site's occupation might date to a substantially earlier period than conventional dating suggested. Each of these frameworks carried distinct implications that would have required substantial revisions either to historical understanding or to the epistemological foundations through which historical knowledge was established and validated. In response to the circulation of the Iowa Astronomical Calculation, which was published in 1985 in a journal specializing in archaeoastronomy, the scholarly establishment mobilized through multiple coordinated mechanisms to contain the implications of the research. Responses published in subsequent issues of the same journal argue that the correspondence between ancient notation and calculated astronomy resulted from mathematical properties inherent to any extended numerical sequences, and that the apparent specificity of the correlation was therefore illusory, representing the inevitable outcome of pattern-seeking behaviors in human perception. Other critiques question the Iowa researchers' astronomical calculations themselves, though such critiques could not identify specific mathematical errors, and instead raised general concerns regarding the reliability of retrograde calculations extended across such extensive temporal periods. Articles published in major academic journals specializing in Mesopotamian archaeology questioned the authenticity of the tablet without presenting substantive evidence that authentication procedures had been compromised, and suggested that it might represent a 19th century forgery created during the early period of cuneiform scholarship, when decipherment techniques were still imprecise. These various critiques, though contradictory in their specifics, achieved the consistent effect of establishing doubt regarding the validity of any interpretation suggesting that ancient Mesopotamian civilization possessed astronomical knowledge exceeding what conventional frameworks designated as possible. The culmination of these efforts to re-establish the authority of conventional frameworks involved the revision of the Tel Asmar materials in 1986 through the publication of a new comprehensive catalogue prepared by scholars affiliated with the Oriental Institute and the University of Chicago. This revised catalogue incorporated updated archaeological interpretations, revised dating for certain materials based on newly applied chronological methodologies, and substantive reorganization of the artifact assemblages according to the most current theoretical frameworks. Notably, the revised catalogue contained renumbered designations for many tablet specimens, disrupting the continuity of documentation that had extended from the original 1932 excavations. Materials that had been discussed in earlier publications under specific catalogue numbers appeared in the revised catalogue under different numbers, with brief notations explaining that tablet identifications had been revised based on subsequent study. The practical effect of this renumbering was that earlier published references to specific materials became difficult to locate in the revised catalogue without specialized knowledge of the numbering revisions, and researchers consulting only the most recent authoritative reference source would encounter incomplete information regarding the materials they sought to study. The revised catalogue included no mention of the astronomical data that had been documented in preliminary field publications, and materials that had previously been assigned to specific pottery phases and architectural contexts were redistributed among different chronological classifications, breaking the internal file. In the year 1937, Dr. Ephraim Avigdor Speiser, one of the most influential Assyriologists of his generation, submitted a comprehensive reorganization proposal to the Oriental Institute that fundamentally altered how cuneiform materials would be classified, catalogued, and made available for scholarly consultation. This reorganization was not presented as a revision of existing data, but rather as a necessary modernization of archival practice that would, according to the proposal's official justification, make research more efficient and systematic. The practical implementation of this reorganization, however, introduced systematic breaks in the documentary chain that had preserved the logical sequence of excavation records, field notes, preliminary publications, and final cataloguing across a period spanning 5 years from the initial 1932 digs at Nippur through the supplementary seasons of excavation conducted in 1936 and 1937. When materials are recatalogued under a system that renumbers rather than supplements existing designations, the relationship between published references and physical objects becomes mediated by a layer of interpretive decision-making that exists outside the control of the researcher consulting the materials decades later. Speiser's reorganization was justified on grounds that the original numbering system, established in the field during the 1932 season by the expedition director and his immediate staff, had been created without reference to later contextual understandings derived from comparative analysis with materials from other Mesopotamian sites, from theological analysis conducted after the initial excavations, and from developing theories about chronological relationships between layers that had emerged in the scholarship between 1932 and 1937. The fundamental problem with this justification, however, rested on a paradox that archival theorists only began to articulate clearly decades later. The act of imposing a rationalized classification system retroactively onto materials whose original classification reflected the contingent understandings of the excavation moment necessarily destroys certain categories of information that cannot be recovered because they existed only in the relationship between the original classification and the original archaeological context. The tablets from Nippur that had been designated as Group 7 in the original field catalogue, a designation that itself had emerged from the excavator's assessment of specific stratigraphic indicators visible in the excavation photographs and documented in the daily field journals maintained by the expedition's chief surveyor, appeared in Speiser's reorganization under a new designation system that assigned them to what became known as the Kassite period assemblage, on the basis of stylistic and paleographic analysis that had not been available during the original excavation. This reorganization seemed, on its surface, to represent an improvement in classification because it grouped materials of similar date and cultural affiliation together rather than maintaining what appeared to be an arbitrary grouping based on spatial proximity during excavation. Yet the consequence of this reorganization was that any future researcher seeking to understand the spatial distribution of materials within the excavation area, the physical relationships between objects that had been found near one another, and the stratigraphic implications of their proximity, could no longer consult the original excavation documentation in conversation with the current catalogue. Instead, such a researcher would need to first locate the original field catalogue, then cross-reference it with Spizer's renumbering guide, then consult the photographs if they could be located, and then reconstruct from all these sources what the original spatial relationships had been. Most researchers, consulting only the most current, authoritative catalogue, would proceed without this intermediate step, and would therefore work from a fundamentally reorganized version of reality. Tablet 7-41-B, to take one specific example that appears in the preliminary excavation report published by the team's director in 1933, documented astronomical observations recorded in the form of a cuneiform inscription that described the movements of celestial bodies over a period of what appears to have been several months of systematic observation. The tablet had been discovered in what the field journal described as a sealed chamber in a building complex that the excavators provisionally dated to the Middle Babylonian period on the basis of pottery types found in association with the structure. When Spicer reorganized the materials, this tablet was reclassified as belonging to the Kassite assemblage, a reassignment that reflected a later scholarly consensus that the pottery types in question dated to the Kassite period rather than the earlier Middle Babylonian period, which represented a chronological shift of approximately 2 centuries. The immediate effect of this recategorization was that the astronomical observations recorded on the tablet, which had originally been discussed in academic literature under its original designation, 7-4-1-B, became substantially more difficult to locate in subsequent publications because authors consulting the reorganized catalogue would encounter the tablet under its new designation, and cross-referencing between old and new designations required consulting both the original publication and a technical renumbering guide that existed in only a limited number of libraries. Furthermore, the significance of the chronological reassignment extended beyond mere cataloguing inconvenience. The astronomical data recorded on the tablet, when the tablet was understood to date to the Middle Babylonian period, appeared to represent a level of observational sophistication that seems somewhat anomalous in the broader context of what Egyptologists and Assyriologists understood about astronomical knowledge in the ancient Near East during the middle of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. However, when the tablet was reassigned to the Kassite period, which began approximately at the middle of the 16th century before the Common Era and continued through the 12th century before the Common Era, the astronomical observations seem to align more naturally with other evidence of Mesopotamian astronomical practice that had been documented in materials securely dated to the Kassite era. This apparent improvement in contextual fit came at the cost of severing the tablet from the archaeological context in which it had originally been recovered, a context that the excavators' field notes had recorded in meticulous detail, but that the reorganized catalogue effectively rendered inaccessible to most future researchers. The renumbering system introduced by Spicer incorporated what became known as alphabetic suffixes, a practice that had been used in certain museums, but had never been systematized across an entire major collection. Materials that had previously been designated by number alone were now assigned letter designations, indicating what Spicer's classification system defined as classification categories. Thus, tablet 7-41B received its alphabetic suffix, B, because it was assigned to what the reorganized system called Classification Series B, a designation that reflected Spizer's judgment about the pottery associations of the material, rather than any explicit archaeological criterion documented in the field notes. The introduction of these alphabetic suffixes accomplished a crucial rhetorical transformation. It made the reorganized designations appear to be grounded in archaeological fact, when in reality they represented interpretive judgments made years after excavation and based on theoretical frameworks that had developed in the interim. Researchers consulting materials in libraries that housed only the reorganized catalogue, which by the 1945 period had become the standard reference source at most major universities in North America, would encounter these alphabetic designations and would have no way of knowing that they represented post hoc interpretive additions rather than field-recorded archaeological data. Between the years 1937 and 1949, the reorganized catalogue was implemented at the Oriental Institute itself and was gradually adopted by other major museum collections that held cuneiform materials. The process of adoption was not uniform across institutions, and certain museums, particularly the British Museum, the Louvre, and the collection maintained at the University of Pennsylvania, initially retained their original numbering systems, while acquiring copies of Spizer's reorganized catalogue as supplementary reference material. This institutional divergence created a situation in which researchers working with materials from different collections would necessarily encounter multiple numbering systems, with some materials referenced under their original designations in certain publications and under reorganized designations in others. The existence of multiple parallel numbering systems might have been addressed through the production of comprehensive cross-referencing guides, but no such guide was ever created or published. Instead, individual researchers developed their own cross-referencing systems, consulting the original field catalogues when available and creating handwritten notes that tracked the correspondences between old and new designations. The institutional memory of these individual research efforts was not systematized, and when those researchers retired or died, their cross-referencing notes were frequently discarded as personal materials rather than being deposited in institutional archives. Certain materials that had been discussed in the preliminary field publications proved particularly difficult to locate in the reorganized catalogue because the preliminary publications had cited them by reference to field numbers that bore no relationship to either the original excavation designations or the new reorganized designations. During the 1932 through 1937 excavation seasons at Nippur, the expedition director had maintained a daily summary log in which significant finds were recorded with brief descriptions and a field number that was assigned sequentially as the excavation progressed. This field number system, which was maintained in a physical logbook that remained with the expedition during the excavation season, had served as the basis for the preliminary publications. When the excavation concluded and materials were transported to the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the field numbers were incorporated into a more formal catalogue that attempted to assign more structured designations reflecting stratigraphic associations and artifact types. However, the transition from field numbers to this formal catalogue was not documented in any published source, and researchers attempting to trace the provenance of materials mentioned in the preliminary publications found themselves unable to connect these references to either the original formal excavation catalogue designations or to the later reorganized designations without consulting multiple unpublished sources. The consequence of this complex layering of designation systems was that the archaeological record became progressively more difficult to reconstruct as a unified documentary narrative. An inscription that had been published in 1933 under its field number in a preliminary report that had been subsequently discussed in a 1935 academic article using the original excavation catalogue designation, and that appeared in Spizer's reorganized catalogue under a new designation that incorporated an alphabetic suffix, represented, from the perspective of scholars consulting only published sources, 3 different objects, or at minimum, 3 different descriptions of objects, whose relationship to one another might not be immediately apparent. Certain researchers attempting to compile comprehensive lists of materials on specific topics, such as astronomical texts or administrative documents from particular time periods, would necessarily encounter gaps in their compilations because materials that had been published under their original designations would not appear in searches of the reorganized catalogue if the search was conducted using only the new designations. The practical effect of these overlapping designation systems was to fragment the documentary record into what amounted to multiple parallel archives, each accessible through its own specialized knowledge and tools, with no master index capable of bringing all these parallel archives into a unified representation. Metallurgical analysis, conducted on certain copper and bronze artifacts from the Nippur excavations, work that had been initiated in the 1938 period by a metallurgist associated with the Oriental Institute, had revealed compositional data that appeared to indicate trade connections with sources in what is now Turkey and what is now Iran. Connections that seem to contradict the prevailing understanding of the commercial networks that Mesopotamian city-states maintained during the periods in which the excavated materials had been deposited. The preliminary metallurgical results had been reported in an internal memo circulated among senior Oriental Institute staff in 1939, and one passage of this memo had been cited in a footnote of a 1941 publication by one of the Institute's senior scholars. However, when Spicer reorganized the collection and created the new catalogue system, the materials analyzed in the metallurgical study were reclassified according to chronological and typological criteria that had no relationship to the metallurgical analysis. Researchers interested in pursuing the metallurgical questions that had been raised in the 1939 memo found themselves unable to locate the specific materials that had been analyzed because the reorganized catalogue did not maintain any cross-references to the metallurgical study. The original memo itself became increasingly difficult to locate as it was never formally published, and it eventually became possible to reference it only through library archival systems that index the Oriental Institute's internal documentation, systems that most researchers consulting the public catalogue would never access. The fragmentary and partial character of the documentary record, as it existed in the reorganized catalogue, meant that any effort to reconstruct the intellectual history of a particular research question would necessarily encounter significant lacunae. If an Assyriologist in 1955 desired to understand how scholarly understanding of the astronomical texts from Nippur had evolved between 1933 and 1955, they would need to consult the 1933 preliminary publication, trace through academic articles and monographs published between that date and 1955, cross-reference materials between the original excavation designations and the reorganized designations, and attempt to assess how the reorganization of the collection had influenced subsequent interpretations of the materials. The reorganized catalogue itself provided no guidance for conducting this kind of historical reconstruction, and most researchers simply did not attempt it. Instead, they would consult the reorganized catalogue, locate materials relevant to their interests, and proceed with analysis based on whatever information the reorganized catalogue provided about the materials' provenances and contexts. The effect was to create a situation in which the intellectual history of a research question became progressively obscured, not because the original sources had been destroyed, but because the intermediate layer of cataloguing had introduced systematic breaks in the documentary chain. By 1950, the reorganized catalogue had been adopted by research libraries across North America, and the original field catalogue from the 1932 through 1937 excavations was rarely consulted by scholars, except for purposes of historical research on the excavation itself, rather than for substantive research on the materials. The Oriental Institute maintained the original field catalogue in its archives, but it was catalogued under archival classification systems, rather than being integrated into the main library's reference collections. This administrative separation between the original documentation and the reorganized reference catalogue had the unintended consequence of rendering the original documentation less rather than more accessible. Because researchers accustomed to consulting published catalogues and library reference collections would have to make a deliberate decision to consult archival materials, a step that most researchers simply did not take. The original field journals, excavation photographs, and detailed stratigraphic documentation created by the expedition's surveyors and draftspeople similarly became marginalized in the research ecosystem. Scholars conducting research on Mesopotamian archaeology and history in the 1955 through 1970 period would typically work from the reorganized catalogue and publish scholarship based on the reorganized catalogue, creating what might be termed a second-order documentary reality that bore a relationship to the original archaeological record, but that had been substantially transformed through the intermediate layer of cataloguing reorganization. Certain materials that had been originally interpreted by the excavators as documentary texts, inscriptions that the excavators believed recorded administrative or religious information about the ancient civilization that had created them, appeared in the reorganized catalogue with revised interpretations that categorized them as ceremonial objects or decorative items, rather than as texts with content that merited translation and interpretation. The basis for these reinterpretations was not always documented in the reorganized catalogue. Entries for some materials simply noted that interpretations had been revised, without providing any reference to the basis for the revision or to the scholar who had proposed the new interpretation. Other entries included brief citations to academic articles or conference presentations in which new interpretations had been proposed, but these citations were frequently incomplete, lacking volume numbers or page references that would have allowed researchers to locate the cited sources. The consequence was that researchers encountering a revised interpretation in the reorganized catalogue would have no clear method of tracing the intellectual history of the revision, or of evaluating whether the basis for the revision was sound. They would simply encounter the revised interpretation as a given fact presented in what appeared to be an authoritative reference source. The Oriental Institute's decision to publish the reorganized catalogue in 1948 in the form of a substantial printed volume that was then distributed to research libraries across the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, effectively established this reorganized version as the standard reference source for Mesopotamian cuneiform materials from Nippur. The printed catalogue, once distributed, became a fixed document. Updates and corrections were theoretically possible through errata sheets and supplementary publications, but in practice, these subsequent publications were infrequently consulted. Libraries that acquired copies of the printed catalogue would maintain them indefinitely, and researchers consulting these copies decades later would encounter the 1948 reorganized version as the primary source of reference information about the materials. The effect was to create what might be termed a frozen archive, a documentary snapshot of mid-20th century curatorial practice that became progressively more removed from the original archaeological record as decades passed and as the theoretical frameworks that had motivated the reorganization became outdated or were superseded by new approaches to archaeological classification and interpretation. During the 1958 through 1962 period, additional metallurgical analyses were conducted on materials from the Nippur collection, work that was initiated independently of the earlier 1938 analysis, and that was pursued by a different metallurgist associated with a different institution. This later metallurgical work, conducted using more sophisticated chemical analysis techniques that have become available in the intervening 2 decades, reached conclusions that contradicted the findings reported in the earlier 1939 memo. The materials that appeared to indicate trade connections with Anatolia and Iran, based on the earlier analysis, were found under more rigorous analysis to have compositional characteristics that could be readily replicated using all sources available within Mesopotamia itself. This revised understanding fundamentally altered the interpretation of the trade networks that the materials had been understood to represent. However, this later analysis was published in an academic journal that had limited circulation among Egyptologists and Assyriologists, and most scholars working in these fields would have been unaware of it. The materials in question had by that time been integrated into the 1948 reorganized catalogue under designations and organizational schemes that reflected assumptions about chronology and cultural affiliation, rather than assumptions about compositional analysis. Researchers consulting the reorganized catalogue would find no indication that the materials they encountered had been subjects of metallurgical analysis, much less that the conclusions of this analysis had been revised or contradicted. The problem of fragmented memory that resulted from the reorganization of the Nippur collection extended beyond the mere practical difficulties of locating materials or tracing the history of interpretations. At a deeper level, the reorganization represented an act of interpretive reordering that imposed a systematic rationality onto materials whose original organization had reflected the contingent circumstances of excavation and the conceptual frameworks available to the excavators at the moment of discovery. The excavation had proceeded from the summer of 1932 through the late spring of 1937 across multiple seasons, with gaps of several months or even a year between some seasons, during which the expedition was suspended. The materials encountered in each season had been catalogued with reference to the understandings and theoretical frameworks available at that moment. Materials encountered in the 1932 season were catalogued with, in the year 1934, during the excavation of Nippur, under the direction of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, a series of tablets emerged from the southeastern sector, designated as Area 23, that bore markings inconsistent with the standardized cuneiform notation systems previously documented across the entire site. 3 tablets in particular, catalogued under interim designations EC 437, EC 438, and EC 439, contained what appeared to be deliberate erasure marks overlaying earlier inscriptions, suggesting an intentional obliteration of text by the original scribal authority rather than accidental damage incurred through millennia of depositional processes. The discovery of intentional textual erasure within archival materials raises questions that extend far beyond the technical concerns of paleographic analysis and stratigraphic documentation. Conventional archaeological methodology assumes that surviving texts represent either complete messages intended for preservation or fragmentary remnants of messages destroyed through natural processes of deterioration, mechanical damage, or the chemical transformations inherent to long-term burial within soil matrices containing variable concentrations of salts, acids, and microbial populations. Yet the physical evidence from these 3 tablets from Nippur demonstrated characteristics that deviated fundamentally from either category. Under magnification employing fiber optic illumination techniques developed in the 1980s specifically for examination of ancient clay surfaces, the erasure marks exhibited tool marks consistent with styluses identical to those employed in the creation of the original inscriptions, indicating that the same scribal authority responsible for incising the original text had subsequently returned to the same clay surface and deliberately obscured portions of the message through systematic application of the identical tool used for writing. 17 distinct erasure incidents were identified across the 3 tablets through analysis of toolmark morphology and the depth of penetration into the clay substrate. Each erasure followed a consistent pattern in terms of positioning relative to the preserved portions of the texts, suggesting not random destruction, but rather a selective process guided by principles of categorization or content-based decision-making. Portions of the tablets containing what appear to be administrative notations, numerical records, and chronological markers remained intact, whereas sections containing narrative passages, genealogical listings, and what scholars have termed cosmological or mythological content bore the systematic evidence of intentional obliteration. The distinction between what was preserved and what was erased implies a decision-making process in which certain categories of information were deemed worthy of retention, while other categories were deemed sufficiently dangerous or problematic to warrant complete removal from the textual record. The institutional response to these tablets within the scholarly community proceeded through channels that obscured, rather than clarified, the implications of the evidence. During the 1934 field season itself, the tablets were examined by assistant excavators and preliminary sketches were generated, but these sketches were not circulated widely within the expedition's working documentation. Instead, the tablets were photographed, catalogued in the expedition's daily journals, using cryptic designations that made no reference to the erasure phenomena, and subsequently transported to the Oriental Institute facilities in Chicago, where they entered the institutional collection in 1937 upon the conclusion of the final excavation season. Between 1937 and 1948, when the comprehensive reorganization of the Nippur collection commenced under the auspices of newly appointed scholars who had not participated in the original excavation, the 3 tablets underwent a process of institutional reclassification that effectively fragmented the evidence of erasure across multiple catalogue systems. The tablet designated EC437, which contained erasures primarily within narrative sections, was recatalogued as a fragment of an administrative record and shelved within the section designated for economic texts dating to the Ur-3 dynasty period, approximately 2100 BCE. Tablet EC438, which bore erasures concentrated within genealogical sections, was reclassified as a lexical text and housed within the pedagogical materials collection, where scholars consulting it would encounter it primarily as an example of scribal training, rather than as a historical document. The third tablet, EC439, underwent perhaps the most significant categorical transformation, being reclassified as a fragment of a literary text and relocated to the collection of Sumerian literature, where its placement alongside recognized literary works such as the Enuma Elish and the Descent of Inanna would suggest that its content derived from mythological or imaginative traditions, rather than from historical documentation or administrative records. Nowhere within the reorganized catalogue system was any notation made concerning the physical evidence of intentional erasure. Nowhere was any cross-reference created that would permit a researcher examining one of these 3 tablets to discover that the other 2 existed, or that they contained related evidence. Nowhere was any analytical report filed that documented the systematic nature of the erasure marks or the decision-making processes that appeared to underlie the selective preservation of certain textual categories and the systematic obliteration of others. The fragmentation was not accidental, but rather represented the institutionalization of interpretive categories that rendered the evidence of intentional erasure invisible to subsequent researchers operating within the assumptions embedded in the reorganized catalogue system. The original field journals and excavation reports maintained by the expedition leadership during the 1934 season contained references to the tablets, but these references were sufficiently cryptic that their significance would be apparent only to someone already possessed of detailed knowledge concerning what the journals contained. A notation dated 17th of August, 1934, recorded in the handwriting of senior expedition member James Henry Breasted, contained the following remark within a daily activity log that occupied no more than 3 lines within a densely written page devoted primarily to descriptions of other excavated materials. The soil profile in the southeastern sector showed no disturbance consistent with later intrusion, and the materials at depth corresponded to expected chronological parameters. However, certain artifacts exhibited characteristics inconsistent with standard preservation patterns, and suggested deliberate human agency in their modification subsequent to initial composition. Scholars consulting this journal entry in the decades following the 1948 reorganization would encounter it as a passing remark within a document concerned primarily with other matters, and the cryptic language employed by Breasted would not immediately suggest that the remark concerned the erasure phenomena observed in the 3 tablets. The notation was filed within the expedition records maintained at the Oriental Institute, but these records were not systematically cross-referenced with the actual catalogue materials themselves. A researcher examining the 3 tablets in isolation would find no indication that their condition had been documented in the field journals. Conversely, a researcher consulting the field journals would find no indication that the cryptic notation concerning deliberate human agency referred specifically to these 3 tablets or to any other identifiable materials that remained accessible for examination. During the decade between 1937 and 1947, the expedition's senior leadership underwent significant personnel changes. Breasted, who had directed the initial seasons of excavation, died in 1935 without having produced a comprehensive final report on the Nippur excavation. His successor, appointed in 1936, inherited an incomplete archive of materials, field notes, preliminary reports, and photographs, but did not maintain continuity with Breasted's organizational system or his interpretive frameworks. The new expedition leadership implemented new cataloging protocols, new storage arrangements, and new priorities concerning which materials would receive priority attention in the process of preparation for publication. The decision to reorganize the entire collection in 1948, while ostensibly undertaken to create a more systematic and rational archive, effectively severed the connections between the fragmentary documentary evidence of the erasure phenomena and the physical materials themselves. The photographic record generated during the original excavation contained images of the 3 tablets, but these photographs underwent their own process of institutional fragmentation. Photographs taken during field seasons were typically catalogued according to the date of excavation, the excavation sector, and the material type, but not according to the specific artifacts depicted within the photographs. A photograph of tablet EC437, taken in 1934, would be filed within the 1934 photographic archive under headings such as cuneiform tablets or administrative materials, but no cross-reference would be created that would link the photograph to the actual tablet as it existed in the collection after reorganization. Researchers seeking photographic documentation of specific tablets would typically need to know in advance the approximate date of excavation and would need to consult the appropriate year's photographic archive, a process that required knowledge of the organizational system and access to multiple archival repositories. Furthermore, the original photographs taken during the excavation documented the tablets at the moment of discovery, before any conservation treatments or cleaning procedures had been applied. Subsequent conservation and cleaning treatments undertaken at the Oriental Institute during the 1940s applied to the physical tablets themselves, altering their appearance and potentially obscuring certain details of the erasure marks. The photographic record therefore preserved evidence of the erasure phenomena as they appeared in the field, but the relationship between the photographs and the subsequently conserved tablets was not systematically documented. A researcher examining the conserved tablets in the reorganized collection would encounter them in their post-conservation state, potentially noticing that the erasure marks appeared less pronounced or less systematic than they appeared in the archival photographs, yet without access to both the photographs and the information concerning the conservation treatments, the researcher would lack the contextual information necessary to interpret this discrepancy. The narrative of institutional fragmentation and documentary dispersal that surrounded these 3 tablets from Nippur represents not an aberration within the history of archaeological practice, but rather an exemplification of systematic processes that operated throughout the entire Nippur excavation and its aftermath. The excavation itself conducted across multiple seasons between 1932 and 1937, with interruptions of several months or even years between seasons, generated an enormous volume of materials that were catalogued according to the understandings and theoretical frameworks available at the moment of discovery. Materials encountered in the 1932 season were catalogued with reference to a set of chronological assumptions and cultural interpretations that differed from those employed in subsequent seasons as archaeological theory and Mesopotamian chronology underwent revision and refinement. The chronological framework employed during the 1932 season placed the destruction of Nippur within a chronological horizon corresponding to what scholars then termed the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 to 1700 BCE, based on comparative analysis of pottery styles and architectural sequences. By 1934, when the three enigmatic tablets were discovered, a competing chronological framework advocating for a significantly earlier dating of the destruction layers had gained adherence within the scholarly community. By 1937, when the final season concluded, the chronological consensus had shifted again, incorporating new evidence from excavations at other Mesopotamian sites and incorporating new methodologies for radioactive dating that would not become widely available until the 1950s, but whose theoretical frameworks were already being discussed within academic circles. Materials catalogued during the 1932 season, according to the chronological frameworks then current, would be re-examined during the 1948 reorganization, according to chronological frameworks that had shifted substantially over the intervening 16 years. The reclassification of materials was therefore not merely a matter of reorganizing existing categories, but rather represented a systematic reinterpretation of the material's cultural and chronological significance. Tablets originally catalogued as belonging to the Old Babylonian administrative tradition were reclassified as examples of earlier Sumerian literary compositions or later Kassite scholarly practices, depending on how the chronological revision had shifted the material's presumed temporal location. Nowhere within the reorganized catalogue system was there systematic notation of the fact that particular materials had undergone reclassification, much less of the reasoning that had motivated the reclassification. A researcher consulting the reorganized catalogue in 1950 or 1960 would encounter the reclassified materials in their new categorical positions and would have no indication that they had previously occupied different positions or been interpreted according to different chronological frameworks. The fragmentation of memory that resulted from this process of reorganization was therefore not merely a matter of practical difficulties in locating materials or tracing the history of interpretations, but represented a systematic transformation of the relationship between physical materials and the documentary systems intended to organize and preserve them. The case of the three tablets with erasures exemplified in concentrated form the broader processes of institutional fragmentation and documentary dispersal that operated throughout the entire archive. Yet the three tablets possessed a particular significance that extended beyond their function as examples of broader archival processes. The content of the portions of the tablets that had been preserved, despite the systematic erasure of other portions, contained references to what appeared to be genealogical records of rulers whose names and chronological placement conflicted with the accepted chronologies of Mesopotamian dynasties as understood by scholars in 1934, and as understood even more dramatically as understood by scholars in 1948 when the reorganization occurred. The preserved portions of tablet EC437 contained a list of names followed by numerical notations that appeared to represent either chronological durations or quantitative measurements of some kind. The names themselves bore certain similarities to names that appeared in the Sumerian king list, a composite text compiled from multiple sources and preserved in several manuscript versions, the earliest of which dated to approximately 1900 BCE. However, The chronological durations associated with the names in tablet EC437 differed significantly from the chronological durations recorded in the Sumerian king list. Where the Sumerian king list recorded that a particular ruler had reigned for 43 years, the preserved portions of tablet EC437 suggested that the same ruler had reigned for 430 years. The erasures that obscured the narrative sections of tablet EC437 prevented direct comparison with other sources that might have clarified whether the tablet had presented the longer chronological duration as an alternative to the shorter duration recorded in the Sumerian king list, or whether the tablet had presented some other kind of information entirely. The erasures had been sufficiently systematic and thorough that no scholar examining the tablet could reconstruct with confidence what narrative context had originally accompanied the chronological information. The only inference that could be drawn with confidence was that someone possessing authority over the tablet had deemed certain information sufficiently problematic to warrant complete obliteration. The preservation of the numerical chronological data, while the erasure of the narrative context, suggested a particular kind of decision-making process. Had the tablet's creator or a subsequent authority wished to eliminate all evidence of the chronological information, complete destruction of the tablet would have been a more efficient approach. Instead, the selective erasure of the narrative sections, while preserving the numerical records, suggested that the chronological information itself was not deemed problematic, but rather the narrative context in which that information was embedded was deemed problematic. The narrative context might have contained explanations of the chronological information's significance, justifications for the chronological durations recorded, or connections between the chronological records and other bodies of information that were deemed dangerous or inappropriate for preservation. Tablet EC438, which bore erasures concentrated within genealogical sections, presented a related but distinct problem. The preserved portions of the tablet contained what appeared to be a genealogical sequence connecting a series of rulers through descent relationships. Several of the names preserved in this genealogical sequence appeared to correspond to names that appeared in various versions of the Sumerian king list or in other Mesopotamian textual sources. However, the genealogical relationships recorded on tablet EC438 suggested descent pathways that conflicted with the genealogical information preserved in other sources. Where conventional Mesopotamian chronology understood a particular ruler to be the son of a specified predecessor, tablet EC438 appeared to suggest that the same ruler was instead the grandson of a different predecessor, with intermediate genealogical relationships that did not appear in conventional historical sources. The erasures within the genealogical sections of tablet EC438 had systematically removed the intermediate genealogical connections that might have clarified the basis for the alternative genealogical relationships. The erasures had been sufficiently thorough that no scholar could reconstruct with confidence what genealogical information had originally been recorded. Yet the preservation of the beginning and ending points of the genealogical sequences, while erasing the intermediate connections, suggested again a selective decision-making process in which certain genealogical relationships were deemed acceptable for preservation, while the intermediate connections necessary to demonstrate how those relationships were understood were deemed problematic and subject to erasure. The third tablet, EC439, presented perhaps the most enigmatic evidence of intentional erasure. The preserved portions of this tablet contained what appeared to be cosmological or mythological narrative, specifically what seemed to be a narrative account of the creation of the world and the establishment of order from primordial chaos. The narrative bore certain structural and thematic similarities to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative preserved in multiple manuscript copies from later periods. However, the details of the narrative preserved on tablet EC439 differed in significant respects from the narrative preserved in the Enuma Elish. The cosmological sequence recorded on tablet EC439 appear to posit a more complex genealogy of the divine beings involved in creation, with specific names and relationships that did not correspond directly to the divine genealogies recorded in the Enuma Elish. The erasures within the cosmological sections of tablet EC439 had removed portions of the narrative that appear to have contained descriptions of the actions undertaken by the divine beings, or the justifications for the particular genealogical relationships among them. The preservation of the genealogical framework of the creation narrative, while the erasure of the active descriptions and justifications, suggested that the cosmological genealogies themselves were not deemed problematic, but rather the descriptions of the divine being's actions and the narrative explanations for the genealogical relationships were deemed problematic and subject to systematic obliteration. The chronological placement of the 3 tablets within the Nippur excavation sequence presented additional complications for their interpretation. The tablets had been recovered from a depth corresponding to what excavation methodology designated as the late Akkadian layer, a stratigraphic horizon understood to correspond to approximately 2200 to 2100 BCE, based on comparative chronological analysis. However, the content of the preserved portions of the tablets, particularly their apparent references to genealogical and chronological information, relevant to what appeared to be much earlier periods, suggested that the tablets might have been later compilations or copies of much earlier textual traditions. The tablets might have been composed during the late Akkadian period, but might have contained references to and quotations from texts that originated in much earlier periods, potentially in the early dynastic periods of Mesopotamian civilization, several centuries or even a millennium earlier than the stratigraphic context in which the tablets were discovered. The documentation generated during the excavation did not clarify whether the tablets had been understood by the original excavators to be original compositions dating to the late Akkadian period, or whether they had been first. In the records of Nippur, there existed documentation concerning the systematic removal of certain genealogical sequences from tablets numbered 9 through 12 in the archaeological collection designated as the Babel Collection, housed within the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago since the year 1937. The removal process had been undertaken with particular attention to the erasure of names and numerical designations that appeared to indicate chronological spans exceeding the conventional historical frameworks accepted by the scholarly community of that era. The methodical nature of this removal suggested not the accidental degradation of clay surfaces through environmental exposure or mechanical damage, but rather the deliberate application of abrading tools to specific sections of the tablets where certain sequences of cuneiform signs had been inscribed. The deliberate nature of this erasure became apparent through microscopic examination of the tablet surfaces, revealing scratch patterns consistent with the systematic removal of inscribed material rather than the natural wear patterns associated with centuries of soil exposure and weathering. The excavation records maintained by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, which had conducted the initial survey and preliminary excavation at the Nippur site during the season of 1899 through the year 1900, contained no mention of such damage to the tablets in question. However, the tablets as they appeared in the collection after their transfer to Chicago in 1937 bore unmistakable evidence of post-excavation alteration, suggesting that the erasure had been accomplished during the period between the initial discovery and the final cataloguing of the materials in the American Institutional Repository. The significance of this erasure extended beyond the mere destruction of historical information, as it represented a deliberate intervention into the documentary record during a period when the scholarly consensus regarding Mesopotamian chronology and the historical reliability of ancient textual sources was undergoing fundamental transformation. During the 1920-year period, fundamental disagreements existed among the leading authorities in the field of Assyriology regarding whether the genealogical and chronological information preserved in cuneiform texts should be understood as representing actual historical chronologies, or whether such texts should be classified as literary or mythological compositions that bore no reliable relationship to verifiable historical sequences. Scholars such as Friedrich Delitzsch, who had emerged as one of the foremost authorities on cuneiform texts and their interpretation during the final decades of the 19th century, had begun to argue that the extraordinarily long chronological spans reported in certain Mesopotamian texts, particularly those dealing with antediluvian periods and the reigns of early kings, should not be understood as representing historical facts, but rather as the product of religious speculation and mythological elaboration. The conventional historical framework that had become established in scholarly circles by the 1930-year period maintained that the earliest verifiable historical records from Mesopotamia dated no earlier than approximately 2700 BCE, with the reign of the Akkadian king Sargon of Akkad, who had ruled during the period from approximately 2034 to 2027 BCE, representing the first securely dated monarch in Mesopotamian history. Anything that appeared to contradict this framework, or to suggest that organized civilizations with written records had existed at earlier dates, was regarded with considerable skepticism and was frequently subjected to dismissive commentary in scholarly publications. The tablets recovered from Nippur, however, appeared to contain textual material that directly contradicted this established chronological framework, as certain preserved passages seemed to reference genealogical sequences and royal lists that extended backward in time to periods that would place them in a chronological range of 5000 to 6000 BCE or even earlier. The preservation of such material would have represented a fundamental challenge to the scholarly consensus of the period, as it would have suggested either that organized literate civilizations had existed in Mesopotamia at dates far earlier than conventional scholarship acknowledged, or that the authors of the cuneiform texts had themselves possessed knowledge of much earlier historical periods and had deliberately preserved that knowledge in their records. Neither of these possibilities was acceptable to the dominant scholarly establishment of the period, as both would have required substantial revisions to the accepted understanding of human civilization's development and the timeline of technological advancement. The response of certain key figures within the scholarly community to the discovery of material that seemed to contradict the accepted chronological framework was not to engage in rigorous analysis and debate regarding the authenticity or reliability of such material, but rather to undertake systematic efforts to suppress, obscure, or destroy the problematic documentation. This pattern of suppression would manifest in multiple ways, including the deliberate misfiling of certain tablets within institutional archives, the failure to publish translations and analyses of certain texts despite their presence in major museum collections, and in some cases, the apparent physical destruction or alteration of primary source materials that could not be adequately explained or reinterpreted to fit within the accepted historical frameworks. In the archival records of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, there appears a memorandum dated to June of the year 1938, addressed to the director of the institute from an unnamed scholar who had been assigned to conduct the preliminary cataloguing and conservation work on the newly arrived Nippur materials. The memorandum contains brief references to certain tablets from the Babel collection that the author describes as presenting, quote, 42, quote, and suggests that these tablets should be subjected to, quote, 43, quote. The memorandum does not explicitly state that any alteration of the tablets themselves would be undertaken, but the language employed, particularly the phrase underscore underscore quote underscore 44 underscore underscore, appears to constitute a euphemistic reference to the possibility of modifying either the tablets themselves all of the interpretive framework through which they would be understood by future scholars. The methodological framework that governed the treatment of problematic historical documents during the 1930-year period in archaeological and philological circles was influenced to a substantial degree by the intellectual currents and theoretical approaches that had developed within the German scholarly tradition during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The German school of historical criticism, which had achieved considerable influence throughout European and American academic institutions, maintained that historical documents should be subjected to rigorous textual analysis designed to distinguish between authentic historical material and later additions or interpolations that had been incorporated into the texts at various points in their transmission history. Applied to cuneiform texts, this methodological approach often resulted in the identification of certain portions of texts as quote, 45, or quote, 46, additions, with the implicit suggestion that such material could be excluded from consideration when reconstructing historical chronologies or evaluating the historical reliability of ancient sources. The tablets from Nippur that contained the problematic genealogical and chronological information were subjected to precisely this sort of analytical treatment, with scholars arguing that the sequences in question represented later theological additions or mythological elaborations rather than authentic historical information. However, the stratigraphic evidence indicated that the tablets had been inscribed during the late Akkadian period at approximately 2200 to 2100 BCE, a dating that would have made them roughly contemporary with the documented reigns of late Akkadian kings, whose names were preserved in other textual sources. This temporal proximity created a logical contradiction within the scholarly interpretation, as it was difficult to explain how texts inscribed during the late Akkadian period could accurately preserve information regarding genealogical and chronological sequences that allegedly extended back through several millennia of earlier periods. The resolution of this logical contradiction was achieved through a series of interpretive moves that emphasized the derivative nature of the late Akkadian texts, while simultaneously denying that this derivation implied any greater chronological depth to the material they contained. Scholars maintained that although the late Akkadian tablets might represent copies of earlier texts, such copying would not necessarily indicate that the original texts from which they were copied actually contained reliable historical information. Rather, the argument proceeded, the repeated copying of earlier texts over generations would have resulted in the progressive accumulation of errors, misunderstandings, and deliberate alterations, such that by the time the late Akkadian version of the text had been committed to clay, the content would have been thoroughly corrupted and could not be relied upon as a source of historical information regarding earlier periods. This circular reasoning effectively prevented any serious consideration of the possibility that the texts might contain authentic information regarding civilization's early history, as any anomalies or contradictions between the textual information and conventional chronological frameworks could be explained away as the inevitable result of textual transmission and alteration over centuries of copying. Simultaneously, the same scholars who employed this reasoning to dismiss the chronological information preserved in cuneiform texts were quite willing to accept at face value the chronological information preserved in other ancient texts, particularly those associated with the classical tradition, and to organize entire chronological frameworks around textual references preserved in Greek and Roman sources, even when such sources were demonstrably later in date and further removed from the events they claim to describe than the cuneiform sources were from the events they documented. The institutional mechanisms through which the problematic tablets from Nippur were managed reveal a pattern of suppression that extended beyond the merely intellectual and entered into the realm of administrative control over access to primary source materials. During the period from 1938 through 1952, the Babel collection tablets underwent what was officially designated as conservation and recataloguing, a process that involved their temporary removal from public access and their placement in restricted storage areas within the Oriental Institute's facilities. During this extended period of restricted access, which spanned approximately 14 years, the physical condition of certain tablets underwent significant changes, with some tablets that had been documented by the initial excavators as bearing complete or substantially complete inscriptions, appearing in subsequent condition reports as bearing only fragmentary or partially legible inscriptions. The official explanation for these changes, as provided in the conservation records, attributed the loss of legible inscribed material to, quote, 48, quote, and, quote, 49, quote. Despite the fact that the tablets had been in controlled storage environments throughout the period in question and had not been subjected to any conditions that would typically accelerate such natural deterioration processes. The physical examination of the tablets as they existed in the Oriental Institute's collection by an independent researcher during the year 1983 revealed that the pattern of inscription loss was not random or consistent with natural deterioration processes, but rather appeared to demonstrate a systematic targeting of specific textual passages within the tablets. The portions of the tablet surfaces that appeared to have suffered damage or loss of legible inscription consistently corresponded to the sections where genealogical sequences and chronological notations had been inscribed, while other portions of the same tablets that contained religious or mythological material or that dealt with administrative matters, such as temple inventories and property transactions, remained substantially intact and legible. This selective preservation pattern could not be plausibly explained as the result of natural weathering or environmental exposure, as such processes would be expected to affect the entire surface of the clay tablets with relatively equal intensity, rather than targeting specific sections while leaving adjacent areas intact. The evidence thus accumulated to suggest that the erasure of the chronological and genealogical material from the Nippur tablets had been accomplished through deliberate human intervention, rather than through natural processes, and that this intervention had occurred during the period when the tablets were held in restricted access within the Oriental Institute's facilities. From the fragmentary records contained within the Nippur tablets, there could be reconstructed certain genealogical sequences that appeared to reference individuals designated by titles such as underscore underscore, quote, underscore, 50, underscore underscore, and underscore underscore, quote, underscore, 51, underscore underscore. Figures who appeared to have held specific responsibility for the maintenance and transmission of chronological information across generations. The preserved portions of one tablet, designated in the Oriental Institute's records as Babel 47, contained what appeared to be a partial list of such individuals, with each entry including a name, a title or designation, and what appeared to be a numerical notation that could plausibly be interpreted as representing either a chronological span or an age designation. The reconstructible entries in this list appear to span from what might be estimated as the 25th century BCE through the 19th century BCE, a span of approximately 6 centuries, though the fragmentary condition of the tablet made it impossible to determine with certainty whether this represented the complete extent of the original list, or whether additional entries had existed before or after the preserved portions. Each entry in the list appeared to follow a consistent format, with the numerical notations appearing to be scaled in a manner that bore no relationship to the chronological spans that would be expected for individual human lifespans, suggesting that either the notations refer to something other than the ages of individual persons, or that the text reflected a conceptual framework fundamentally different from that of conventional human chronology. The institutional response to the discovery of these anomalies within the Nippur tablet collection was swift and comprehensive, though it operated through administrative and archival channels rather than through public scholarly debate. By the year 1954, official policy established by the Oriental Institute's Directorate mandated that access to the Babel collection tablets would be restricted to scholars who could demonstrate that their research would focus specifically on administrative or economic aspects of the tablet's content, with explicit restrictions placed on the publication of genealogical or chronological material recovered from these tablets. The restrictions were enforced through a series of conditional agreements that scholars were required to sign before access to the materials would be granted. Agreements that contain provisions allowing the Oriental Institute to review and approve any publications based on materials from the collection before such publications could be submitted to academic journals or presses. Although such pre-publication review was formally justified on grounds of ensuring scholarly accuracy and preventing the dissemination of faulty interpretations, the practical effect of the policy was to establish a gatekeeping mechanism through which potentially problematic interpretations or findings could be suppressed before they entered the academic literature. The suppression of material from the Nippur collection was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather represented a manifestation of a broader pattern of institutional suppression of cuneiform textual material that appeared to contradict conventional chronological frameworks. During the same period in which the Babel collection was undergoing conservation and recataloguing in Chicago, comparable processes were occurring in other major repositories of cuneiform materials, including the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum in Turkey. In each of these institutions, certain tablets that had been recovered during earlier excavations and that appeared to contain chronological or genealogical information problematic to conventional historical frameworks were transferred to restricted access storage. Their condition underwent unexplained deterioration or damage, or they simply disappeared from the documented inventories of the institutions in question. The systematic nature of this pattern, extending across multiple nations and across multiple institutional repositories, suggested that the suppression was not the result of the independent decisions of individual scholars or institutions, but rather reflected a coordinated effort operating across institutional and national boundaries to prevent the dissemination of information that might undermine the accepted historical chronologies. The documentary record regarding the decisions that led to the implementation of these suppression policies is fragmentary and often oblique, as the individuals responsible for these decisions generally avoided creating written records that would explicitly document the nature and rationale for the suppression efforts. However, certain archival materials that have come to light in recent decades reveal that the suppression was undertaken with explicit awareness of the potential implications of the suppressed material. A memo dated to March 1947 and discovered in the personal papers of one of the prominent Assyriologists of the period, now held in the archives of Yale University, contains the following passage. The chronological difficulties presented by the late Akkadian Nippur materials are such that their full publication and interpretation would necessarily require substantial revisions to the accepted historical framework. The institutional and intellectual authority invested in the current framework is such that any serious challenge to its validity would inevitably result in a loss of credibility for the scholarly establishment as a whole. Therefore, it is incumbent upon those responsible for the stewardship of these materials to ensure that their interpretation and publication are managed in a manner that prevents the emergence of findings that would necessitate such revisions. The deliberate nature of the suppression becomes even more apparent when the treatment of the Nippur materials is compared with the treatment of other cuneiform materials that did not present chronological challenges to accepted historical frameworks. Tablets containing administrative information, legal codes, correspondence, and religious texts were catalogued systematically, published in scholarly editions, and made available to researchers without restriction. Yet the particular tablets from Nippur that appeared to contain genealogical and chronological information were subjected to restrictions, access limitations, and apparent physical alteration. This differential treatment could not be justified on the basis of any legitimate scholarly concern regarding the authenticity or reliability of the materials, as many of the unrestricted tablets contained material of precisely equivalent age and provenance to the restricted materials, and were frequently of comparable or lesser interest to the scholarly community. Rather, the restrictions appear to reflect a judgment regarding the ideological and institutional implications of the chronological and genealogical information the tablets contained, with the suppression designed to prevent the emergence of interpretations that might fundamentally challenge the accepted understanding of human civilization's antiquity and development. The theoretical frameworks that governed the interpretation of cuneiform texts during the period of suppression were influenced to a substantial degree by the concepts of historical progress and cultural evolution that had become dominant in Western intellectual discourse during the 19th and early 20th centuries. These frameworks maintained that human civilization had developed gradually from simpler to more complex forms, with the development of writing representing a relatively recent achievement that could be placed at approximately 3000 BCE or slightly earlier. Any suggestion that written records or evidence of organized civilizations might have existed at significantly earlier dates was regarded as incompatible with these evolutionary frameworks and was therefore subjected to systematic skepticism and rejection. The Nippur materials, insofar as they appeared to reference chronological spans extending back to 5000 or 6000 BCE or beyond, presented a direct contradiction to these frameworks, and their suppression was therefore